It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time now, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 90, where we have looked at all matters political and media in Australia and then take a good look around the world. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate.
G'day.
Busy time in Hong Kong at the moment.
It is. We had a public holiday last week for the National Day, and of course that becomes a week-long holiday in the mainland. So the figures show that we had 980,000 mainlanders come through Hong Kong last week.
A million people, more or less.
As a mate of mine said, all of them were standing in front of me at the queue to try and get a taxi.
And do you notice the difference?
Yeah, you can.
You'd have to, wouldn't you?
And the mainlanders look different. They dress different and all that sort of stuff. But of course,
I mean, just in terms of services and things like that, do you notice the difference in terms of, well, I don't know, you'll just go down to the pub most afternoons and that's about it, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you can notice the difference if you're going around town that there are now queues at restaurants and all that sort of stuff, and that's a wholly good thing. Hong Kong is quietly cheering that. But balanced against the 980,000 who came this way, as there is every week, 200,000 Hong Kongers go across to Shenzhen.
Right.
And the reason for that, that number's increased.
Shopping, a bit of shopping?
This shopping, go across there for lunch because the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar and it's risen against the RMB quite a bit. So if you go across there and have a big banquet for lunch, you pay about 40% of a Hong Kong price for the same meal. So that's very attractive.
Hong Kongers love a bargain, Jack.
They do. So, and for most Hong Kongers, going across to Shenzhen's a bit like you going into the central Sydney. You know, it's a no more onerous journey than that.
Right. Okay. Well, that'll all be very good for the economy.
If you catch the fast train, it's 20 minutes. So.
Well, there you go. All right. Well, enjoy all of that, Jack. I'm sure you'll love the crowds. If you're hoisted with a country background, you'll hate them, won't you? You'll just hate crowds.
No, mate. I grew up in a town of 2,000 people and I've spent my whole life moving to bigger and bigger cities. I love cities.
There you go. All right. Well, Jack's having a ball at the moment. Labor, not so much. And there was actually quite a good piece in John Menadue's blog written by Bill Kelty, former ACTU boss, and the co-author of The Accord with Paul Keating, Jack. I've got that right.
Yeah.
And Bill's saying, well, the headline says Labor has lost its way, but the article, once you read it, is actually a very thoughtful approach to why Labor is in the trouble it is in, and suggesting, well, a number of things. Tax reform, particularly for Middle Australia, and perhaps just a strategic thing about not being so self-congratulatory. Looking at polling just recently, Jack, it seems to me that Labor is paying a heavy price for inflation and the cost of living issues in Australia. And so when you get either Treasury or you get either Chalmers or Albanese or one of the senior government figures talking about how they have helped Australians through with their finances, that tends to rub the wrong way. But tell me a little bit about Bill's piece, Jack. I read it, enjoyed it.
Look, I just recommend, I'm not going to try and pass it down to a paragraph or two because it doesn't lend itself to that. I just recommend to readers that you Google Bill Kelty, Labor has lost its way, and you'll find it in Pearls and Irritations, John Menadue's blog, and it's worth a read.
Yeah, it definitely is. And look, the headline, often we see headlines that don't mix, that conflict openly with the article that you're reading. And when I first saw the headline, I went, oh, here we go. But it's actually a very thoughtful approach to politics more generally in this country.
Yeah, one of the things he does talk about is that Australia has a sort of a national compact that we have in return for allowing a fairly free rein for capitalism. We had have a kind of a national safety net, and that's been a bipartisan thing, and really still is. Right from the turn of the last century. And he talks that up quite well. And he also talks up productivity. I think he's right to do that. I mean, that's the one thing the government doesn't want to talk about, and nor do the opposition for that matter. But that's the key to fixing the cost of living crisis and the economy, is to build up productivity again.
Yes, indeed. That's one of the main points that he does make. So that is one of those recommendations we would make. It's no point us reading it out to you. It's a long piece. It'll take 5-6 minutes of your day, listeners. But if you have a look at John Menadew's blog and Bill Kelly's contribution with the somewhat mischievous headline, Labor has lost its way, but it's a good overview of Australian politics and where we are right now from one of the movers and shakers in Australian politics in days of yore.
In fairness to John Menadew, it's not a bad headline, but it's meant to attract attention. That's the job of the headline, and it does that.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, some of the smartest people in the world write headlines for the Sun, Jack.
My favourite is still the New York,
at least.
Is still the New York Post headless body and topless bar.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Look, there's a great story behind that, which we won't go into at the moment. But as the subs were finally collating all of the business, they thought, yes, we can run this headline. Headless man found in topless bar.
Or in Australian terms, I think it was Billy dies on the job.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Snedden died on the job. That was the Melbourne Truth, I believe, Jack.
It was.
Speaking of bars, bit of a stretch, but our glorious leader in New South Wales extended trading hours for pubs and licensed premises for a couple of hours on grand final night on Sunday. They could trade until midnight, until 10, provided they had the footy on the telly in the bar. They could do that, which seems quite reasonable. And this was not met, but this is sort of confronted by a piece written by Steve Waterson, a very, very lovely, learned fellow who's been the Australian for a very long time, writes quirky pieces. And this one is him being declined to buy a double of, I think, rum. I think he was on the rums. And he asked for a large one and was told by the bar staff at a pub that has not been named, but it'd be somewhere in the Surrey Hills district of Sydney. And
he names it. It's the Aurora.
It could be the Angora. It could be the Evil. I'm not quite sure. The Evil is the Evening Star, which is just a little bit further down Elizabeth Street. And so it's the Angora, according to the journalists that use the Angora and the Evil. But it could be one or both of those. But it may well be the Aurora. We don't know. But when he asked for a double, or he said a large one, please, he was told by the bar staff, I'm not allowed to serve doubles. It's against the law. He said, I actually don't think it is. And I've checked this, and it isn't. It used to be prohibited. The licensed premises were prohibited in the lockdown days of serving doubles after midnight. But I think that law is gone. Anyway, Steve did not get his double, even though he suggested that he have one glass with a single and then another one with just a straight shot in it. But that was all knocked back. But yeah, I'm not sure that these are rules that we have. What it probably does tell us is that we have these terrible confusion of licensing laws in Australia, and particularly in New South Wales. We're seeing more and more now sort of little bars coming forward. That was prohibitive for a long time for any investor or anyone who wanted to run a little bar in Sydney had to pay an exorbitant licence fee. Fingers were pointed at the Australian Hotels Association, New South Wales clubs, etc., for sort of requiring these things. But there was an enormous investment required just to get the licence. up to $250,000. And meanwhile, Melbourne was going around issuing licences for $1,200 for premises that hold 30 or 40 people. So we do have really difficult, complex, unnecessarily complex licensing laws in this country, and certainly in this state.
Do you remember the days back in the 90s where you would be greeted at the door of a new premises and asked, "Do you intend to dine?"
Yeah.
And of course, the answer was, "Oh, well, my word, I'll be eating at some stage this evening."
Yes. There was, what was that terrible place in the Cross, Jack, that was open all hours?
The test tube. The test tube lab, it was called. They used to serve people shots in test tubes. And
No. There's another one. You just buy a can of drink. You buy a can of beer. They would serve cans of beer. It was all 2:00 in the morning, bad time to be out and about. But you were served a compulsory bowl of chips because you had to eat.
Did Barron's do that?
Barron's, thank you. Yeah. That's Barron's. I was actually at Barron's last night of trading. That would have been about 2007. But yes, they had the compulsory bowl of chips, so you could say that you'd eaten while you were drinking. Just ridiculous stuff, Jack. And a lot of it, as I say, we can point fingers back to the various lobby groups around licensed premises in the state that sort of poo-poo the idea of, I guess, licensing reform. So we have a series of complex and arcane sort of laws around it. Quick question, Jack. Have you ever been RSA'd out of a pub?
No, but I watched a good mate get RSA'd at my local in Sydney, next door to me. I picked him up and dropped him in the back bar where he was attending a function for his daughter's school, and he'd lunched rather extensively. And I went in the front bar and was having a beer with the publican. And about half an hour later, my pal arrived in the front bar to say that he had been RSA'd at a school function.
At a school function. That's not good.
And the publican, who was a very practical man, said, "Well, okay, what can I get you?"
Good on him. I've only been RSA'd twice, Jack, and that was both at the Clock Hotel in
Surrey Hills.
Surrey Hills. The second time, I can say on both occasions I was well and truly lubricated, and there were no arguments, and I left the premises on the first occasion. The second one, I was not permitted to return. I had a hotel room a few blocks up, and the fellow said, "I can't let you in. You've had a bit too much to drink." And I just went, "I've got a hotel room just up the road." Yeah, I agreed. I couldn't have agreed more with the fellow, so I just went back upstairs and started drinking water so I didn't feel so bad the next day.
The important point about this thing is that we have laws that are just foolish, particularly in New South Wales, and the two areas where it's most prevalent, the restaurant and bar licensing rules and the taxi licensing rules. And they have built up a whole capital stock where the real value of the thing is in the piece of paper that the government gives you.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's good. That needs to be unwound.
It does.
And you can't do it overnight, but you get it done.
If only that Steve Waterson can have a double whenever he likes, but perhaps not at that particular pub anymore because he's told people he'd never darken its door again. Meanwhile, Jack, in Victoria, a statue is to be built of Dan Andrews. My Lord, this is dumb. Let me say, I've got a fair amount of time for Dan Andrews' political skills, and I think he's done some great things for Victoria. I would say that his long lockdowns would count against him in terms of his reputation, in terms of his contributions to the state. But he's only just gone, so the idea that you knock out a statue for a guy who, at best, is seen as a fairly controversial figure is just some really dumb politics. Who made the suggestion?
No idea who made it, but it was made. I mean, Sydney doesn't have a statue to Neville Wran or that.
It's rare, isn't it? I mean, there are lots of statues in Melbourne, of course, particularly around the G, of sporting figures. There's the Shane Warne. I think there's a Trumper. There's all sorts of statues for sporting greats, and I don't think too many people would have a problem with that. But for politicians, it is kind of weird, with the exception of Canberra, where there's a bit of weirdness there anyway.
And Ballarat, of course. Ballarat has the statues of all the prime ministers in the garden.
That's their thing, that's their little tourist pitch, wander through the botanical gardens of Ballarat there. But Paul DiMartino, who is no friend of Dan Andrews, he was quite outspoken during the lockdowns. I think he owns at least one cafe, doesn't he? He owns former AFL player.
A couple of pubs and a couple of restaurants, I think.
Right.
He's very, very well run they are at that.
So Paul DiMartino, who said, we are going to spend, he's a former Western Bulldogs footballer, wasn't he? We are going to spend $100,000 on a statue of a moron. That might be a little excessive, but I can't understand how a statue would cost $100,000. Go on.
Yeah, I just can't. I would think if you were Dan Andrews, you'd be saying this is a bad idea.
I'm not sitting for this. I'm not going to sit for this. And I'm sure that's what he's thinking. Of course, there was a statue in the city of Batman Jack, which had to be removed because it turned out that John Batman was a syphilitic mass murderer and didn't have the sort of values we expect, even in 19th century terms. So he got shot down. There'd be a real chance that anywhere you put the Dan Andrews statue is going to be defaced fairly quickly.
Yes,
quicker than Captain Cook, I'd say.
Yeah,
a bit of paint and maybe the angle grinder out too. Chop him off at the angles.
Yeah. So a very
stuff,
poor idea, and I'm sure Dan Andrews thinks so as well.
I'm going to have a bit of a look into who thought this was a good idea in the first place and let you know next week, listeners. Meanwhile, we had protests over the long weekend for New South Wales and Queensland. There might be another state in there, but certainly not Victoria, celebrating Labor Day, the 40-hour week. Melbourne celebrates that event in April. But New South Wales, Queensland do it on the first Monday of October. And, of course, there were protests on the Sunday in Melbourne and Sydney. We talked about the flying of the Hezbollah flag, Jack, and I wrote about that last week for the Oz. They've got some very convoluted law there, which is probably unenforceable, and that's federal law created with bipartisan support with the coalition. I think everyone voted for it in the end and thought themselves to be very, very clever, and then it turns out you can't really enforce the law, Jack. Or the police don't seem to think you can. Just toting it is not enough, because the original legislation was designed to prohibit the display of swastikas and Nazi symbols. And then, of course, it was understood that the swastika is a symbol of religious significance for the Buddhists, for the Jains, for the Hindus.
Hindus as well, I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so into that legislation, they had to create a test that it wasn't just the display of this thing, which may have significance for Hindus, for example, but they also needed to prove to a magistrate or indeed a judge or a jury that they had an intention to cause, that they had an intention to incite others to acts of, I guess, intimidation, harassment, etc., on the basis of race. And then they came in behind that, Jack, and this all came from the Attorney General's Department, not the Parliament. It wasn't a, sort of last breath addition to the legislation. Well, it certainly was from the Attorney General's Department, that they included symbols of prescribed terrorist organisations that also necessarily have the same test. So it's, because it was just cobbled together. And so these things are unenforceable.
It wasn't passed with the aim of enforcing it. It was passed with the aim of being seen to do something.
Exactly right. And when they did, Senator James Patterson from the Coalition, I think he's their Foreign Affairs spokesperson at the moment, he was part of the orgy of self-congratulation, Jack. and continues to maintain in his social media that displaying the flag, let's say the Hezbollah flag on its own, is sufficient to have created an offence, and the legislation just doesn't say that at all. So anyway, really dumb stuff. And what we did see on the weekend, after there was much talk about prosecutions, there was one woman a 19-year-old woman who turned herself in for displaying the Hezbollah flag. I don't think she's been charged.
Yeah. Always be wary of politicians who are full of self-congratulations.
Yeah, there was a bit of, the legislation's not bad if you take out the prescribed terrorist organisations. If you're saying we want to prohibit the display of Nazi symbols, then that legislation would have been perfect as it stood. But when you tack on something else, you're sort of trying to kill two birds with one stone. But what you're really doing is dealing with law to create to solve two distinct problems, and it's an abject failure as a result. Peter Dutton, of course, did call on the government to reconvene Parliament. I'm sorry, I kind of laugh, but it's just a cynical move. And they would consider the law, while Senator James Patterson was saying this law is good enough. So very, very strange weekend. Anyway, what we did see, Jack, on the weekend was what we might call proxy Hezbollah flags, which actually doesn't get around the legislation. But that's what people were doing. They were carrying, there was a Ned Kelly figure on a flag. They must be whipping up these flags in the garage at home, because it was done pretty quickly. There was a Hezbollah flag with Ned Kelly toting the AK-47, and
lots of people carrying photos of Nasrallah as well.
And again, we talked about this last week, but just carrying a photograph of an individual, regardless of who they are, I would think would not be sufficient to trigger that federal law by way of prosecution. So all pretty dumb stuff. We also had this, the to and fro from state premiers and the federal government and the opposition saying, please don't march on this day. And indeed, it would have been pretty unpleasant to mark the anniversary of the October 7 Hamas terrorist attack with, shall we say, I'll say pro-Palestinian rally.
Yeah, the New South Wales Premier, who has a very safe pair of hands, once again got this right. He said having protests on October 7, pro-Palestinian protests, would be grossly insensitive. I don't think it's appropriate. That is my personal view, he says, to hold a thing.
This is very good, Jack. Keep going.
To hold a protest or a rally or on a day when people were massacred on the other side of the world is grossly insensitive, in my opinion. And the reason that's sure-handed is that he's not saying we're going to crack down on this. He's just saying, I think this is wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's the way to go. You don't have to be a free speech absolutist to support the idea that people can protest in our streets, regardless of whether it's offensive to you or not, that people have that right in our society. So when politicians start normally saying, we don't want you there, and in fact I know Minns did look at the issue and the police did look at the issue of not issuing a permit for the rally in Sydney before deciding we'll just let it go. Once you prohibit the rally, then it gets messy. Then the police kind of have to act regardless of the nature of the situation.
And they were sensible. They said, we will give you a permit to rally. You can't go anywhere near the Great Synagogue on Elizabeth Street, et cetera, et cetera. They gave them some restrictions that made sense.
Yeah. And look, I dare say most of the protests that we see on our streets at any given time on any given subject, I would sort of profoundly disagree with. But at the same time, I certainly support their right to do so. And that's where you can't have, and simply you cannot use police as punching bags either. So if you prohibit a rally, ban it, and it happens anyway, then the police are going to have to wade in.
Yeah,
and it's just a shocking waste of police resources.
The only new law I would favour is no masks.
Yeah, look, when I wrote about the flag issue last week, that's what a number of people came and said. One of them might have been you if you're using an alias, but it was a similar sort of It was a similar sort of remark, yeah. That, and I tend to agree, but there are issues around enforcement, and people, if they're serious about what they're protesting for, they should be good enough to, show their faces about it, whether it's a pro-Palestinian rally or whether it's a climate change rally or it's one of the Freedom Party freaks who've been sort of rallying a bit in our cities of late. Show your face. You should be one who wants to be counted. But, in terms of making it illegal, I just can't see how that would work. 15,000 demonstrators, pro-Palestinian demonstrators, marched through the Sydney and Melbourne CBD. So it's a combined figure, and that'd be an estimate. From the numbers I saw on the news, seems to be about right. About 10,000 at Sydney's Hyde Park. And what were they doing, Jack? Were they reading out missives from Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the current mullah and tyrant of Iran, Jack?
Yeah, I believe they did.
Have you had a look at X lately? Twitter? Some of the stuff there is just mad. I mean, I stand with Iran. There was a woman there who'd created the hashtag I stand with Iran. I mean, one of the most repressive regimes on earth, especially for women. And
this is the horseshoe
with
effect.
Iran on. And this is basically, I looked at the name. It was an anglicised name.
This is the horseshoe effect, isn't it? The maddies from both ends of the spectrum get together.
Yeah, but this, as a hashtag, I stand with Iran. I mean, like I stand with Kim Jong Un. I stand with the military mob who run Myanmar. I mean, it's just bizarre. Anyway, look, the protests were lawful, and I think all reports indicated fairly peaceful or reasonably peaceful. Might have been offensive to a whole lot of people, including Jewish Australians, but sometimes this is just part and parcel of being in a messy democracy, Jack.
Yes, I agree.
All right. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, I think their naval capacity has been reduced by about 20%, with HMNZS Manawanui hitting a reef and sinking. All 75 crew on the board were rescued safely. The captain, an experienced captain, didn't go down with the ship, Jack, as they're supposed to. Gave the evacuation order, and no one was hurt. But it means that New Zealand's Navy, I think they've only got 5 active ships, and none of them would be battle cruisers or anything like that.
But they have 2 Anzac frigates, like the Australian ones, which generally means that it's a bit like buying a Jaguar. You've got to be able to buy 2 because one will be in the dock getting repaired all the time. And a lot of the Australian newspapers were saying that the captain who was at the helm was in fact a British-born person. Of course, she wasn't at the helm. She was on an inflatable getting the hell out of there.
Reminds me of that wonderful Monty Python sketch where they were up on the brig. There they are, John Cleese as the captain, issuing evacuation orders, women and children first, and his co-officers are all dressed as women and children, but they'd run out of costumes. And so the next guy turns up as an astronaut. Said women and children and astronauts first. It goes on, Native American, all that sort of stuff.
This happened on a reef off Samoa, and unfortunately,
don't they have, a capacity to understand where a reef is?
They were
sonar, that sort of thing.
This was a vessel that's designed to map the seabed. That's what it was doing there. And it hadn't been mapped for some time. It might have been out of date. In any event, quite a few of them
printer was out of ink.
Quite a few of them got tipped out of their inflatable and had to walk across the reef to the land to get safety. So they're in hospital having treatment for cuts and bruises. Yeah. But this is all very interesting. All the time I lived in Potts Point, nearly every day there was a New Zealand frigate parked down at Fleet Base down in Woolloomooloo Bay. It was there nearly all the time. One of my mates used to say the reason that they berthed it there is so they can plug into our power supply rather than use their own. But I shouldn't be knocking Kiwis because I keep an eye on Facebook and you have come out of the
I
closet
have come out of the closet.
as a Kiwi this week.
More on this tomorrow. Well, I think that will be Thursday in the Australian. Yes, I did a little online test, listeners, where, and I kind of knew this was the case, but it was just confirmed that I am a New Zealand citizen by descent. And more than coming out of the closet, Jack, I'm going to pay the $220 that I'm required to register my New Zealand citizenship. Now, I haven't looked into it enough whether I have the capacity to vote there. They may have some sort of residential restriction, and they probably should. And then it's a quick step to a New Zealand passport. I can have a couple. I can have the Australian one and the New Zealand one.
Yes, well, I rather enjoyed it on Facebook. From all the comments, it read like this was coming out of the closet and disclosing a previously unknown shameful secret.
Well, I can tell you, my rugby game has improved overnight.
Yeah.
But I am going to go to the homeland in December. I'm taking my wife away for a trip around Fjordland, around Queenstown, which is in Otago, and Tiana and Milford Sound, do all those things. And I'll see if I have an affinity for the place. I do have family there, of course, mum's family, but I will be studiously avoiding them for my trip to get that sense of, do I belong here?
Is that because they're dual Presbyterians? But
I know, mate. No, they're a lot weirder than that. If they were just Scottish Presbyterians, I could cope with it. There's a few of that ilk. And there's quite a few who have embraced the pedagogy or the ideology of John Smith, the Mormon.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did notice the figures yesterday that New Zealand lost 50,000 people last year. Almost all of them in Australia.
I am going to write about this, but it sounds like they're a little bit needy, don't they, when they say, we don't know who you are, and we don't know where you live, but we would welcome you becoming a New Zealand citizen any time, just because your mum was. And that's it. It just caused huge problems for Barnaby Joyce and others along the Section 44 stuff, Jack.
Yeah, well, the Irish are even needier. If you've got an Irish grandparent, you're in.
Oh, gee, I'll be off a chance, see. Oh, look, I might end up with multiple citizenships, Jack, and avoid enforcement in one jurisdiction. Just jump on a burner and off you go, where you'll be welcomed again. So, yeah, that'll be a piece that I write tomorrow. I'm looking forward to telling my editor, who's a lovely fellow, that I am a secret New Zealander. All right. A ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon. Is it viable, Jack? Penny Wong seems to think so.
But then Penny Wong thinks a two-state solution's viable as well, and I don't think either are viable. I think there's no good reason to have a ceasefire. They're not viable
in the here and now, are they? They're not viable in the foreseeable future, are they?
No, they're not. They're very popular amongst progressive Westerners, but they're not popular in the Middle East.
I'll go a step further. You can talk about progressive Westerners, but this is the 5 bob each way argument, isn't it? You know, this is how we try and get our messaging balanced between those who are listening who are pro-Palestinian and those who are listening who are pro-Israel, and that's the sign. It's a muddled sign, and it probably annoys both parties at the same time in many ways. It's, I know the US or the Biden administration refers to a two-state solution fairly frequently.
As does the Australian government.
Yeah, as does the Australian government. And there are a number of countries across the world who say the same sort of things. But in the fog of war, which we're in at the moment, these things are being kicked down the road by the players, by the participants in this conflict.
Well, the only people Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran have never been in favour of a two-state solution.
No, they would need to be dragged to the table to consider it.
Yeah.
And they've been dragged to the table on a number of occasions and they won't consider it.
Yes. Yeah. So without someone to negotiate with, it's not a viable thing at all.
Yes. Well, let's have a look at. Well, firstly, I wanted to say a bit of breaking news, Jack. Fatima Payman, the former Labor senator who got in as I think Labor's third senator in the most recent election, has since. Well, I think she wasn't expelled from the party, but she left of her own volition. She has now announced a party will run what she describes full body contact, and that's a quote, competition with Anthony Albanese, backed by disaffected former Labor candidates who could stand in electorates, including the Prime Minister's own inner West Sydney seat of Grayndler. It's an unnamed, unregistered party so far, Jack, but Fatima Payman saying we're going to cause you some mischief in Western Sydney.
If you were the third Labor senator elected in Western Australia, and you are making threats against the Labor Party, you really are a fool.
Yeah, it's something that they should be concerned about, though. It may be hollow, and Payman, just the look of her, doesn't seem to be the great force of a political will that she perhaps thinks she is. But a party that does resonate with Western Sydney and parts of Melbourne and other parts of the country might cause Labor a lot of problems at the next election, Jack.
It could cause them some inconvenience, that's true, but the party itself will never have any power.
Indeed. And it seems to be, well, not so much a thought bubble, but it is an unnamed and unregistered party so far. So Fatima Payman talking about full body contact, we shall see. Meanwhile, Jack, this has been pretty widely reported. In Lebanon, there's a small platoon of Irish peacekeepers that have refused Israel's demand to evacuate their post in Lebanon. Around 300 Irish soldiers are not relinquishing their post. Unlike the Dutch in Srebrenica, 70 members of the platoon who were on leave before Israel's invasion wish to rejoin their unit, and they're hanging tough in Lebanon, Jack.
Yeah, they belong to what's known as UNIFIL, which is a UN body that was formed that was supposed to be policing the southern border of Lebanon to prevent missiles being fired into Israel. So perhaps they've got comfortable accommodation there because they don't seem to have been doing any work.
What do they do? Just watch them come over the top?
Yeah, basically. Yes, it would seem.
We'll see how that goes there too. But that peacekeeping force included Australians, didn't it, for a long time?
It did for some time, I think, yes.
In that sort of post-Civil War phase in Lebanon. James Dreyfus, Jack, he's an actor of considerable credit, an English actor, a very gay man, and does a lot of comedy, does a lot of sitcoms in the UK and also a lot of stage work. James Dreyfus came up with this on Twitter and he said, "I cannot imagine what the last year has been like for Jewish people around the world. I don't profess to, but witnessing the blatant, purposely hateful, disgusting anti-Semitism on our streets week in, week out has been a truly depressing and horrific spectacle, made worse by the institutional apathy to seriously tackle it. I'm so sorry your country has let you down so abysmally. I don't think I've ever been so ashamed to call the UK my home." And that's from James Dreyfus, who's not a Jew and Anglo-Saxon progressive, we might say, in the UK.
Indeed.
What did Michael Gowenda have to say, Jack?
Well, he's talking about the lament that's widespread amongst progressive Jews around the world. And Jews trend very progressive, really. They in Australia, they generally vote Labor, and in the US, they generally vote Democrat, and they generally vote Labor in the UK as well. And I've been speaking to some of these people, and they feel completely abandoned, that the people who they thought would support them have just decided to turn against them.
I told the story of a person that I know, more a friend of a friend. She's a doctor at Prince of Wales. She's an oncologist, actually, and she's in the business of saving people's lives. This was some time ago after the October 7 attacks, and she had one relative as part of the IDF who was actually in Gaza. She had another more distant relative who had been taken hostage in Gaza on October 7, and she had family in Israel. And she was basically fretting about this. But she decided to engage with people online who were making the normal progressives, who were making sort of anti-Zionist sort of comment. And she wanted to explain her own anxiety and her own views without being strident about them. She's just not that person. She might be as an oncologist, but not in social media, on politics and ethnicity. And she was called a baby killer for promoting the killing of babies. This is a person who saves lives for a living.
Yeah.
So a lot of those people find themselves basically unsupported and basically alone in dealing with some fairly awful online abuse.
Yeah. So Michael Gawenda, who's a former editor of the Melbourne Age.
Thank you for that. Yes.
And as a former Melbourne Age editor, his politics are fairly progressive.
I would imagine so.
Yeah, and he feels, say, abandoned by the Labor Party. That's a common thing in amongst New York Jews. Donald Trump is 50-50 with Kamala Harris amongst New York Jews, Manhattan Jews. And that's extraordinary because they are very progressive, very left, but they feel abandoned by the Democrat Party. This is going on all around the world.
Yeah, it is.
And they're a small number of people. They are not an election-deciding number of people anywhere, really. But it's a notable experience, I mean, you can't ignore it.
All right. Moving on, Jack, to the Arab world. You've got a post in here that the United Arab Emirates deported a Palestinian student for shouting "Free Palestine" and wearing a keffiyeh during a graduation ceremony in Abu Dhabi. The UAE has banned all public displays of support for Palestine and considers Hamas a terrorist organisation.
Yeah,
that's the Emirates.
That's also true. That the same laws apply in Saudi and in Egypt to a large extent, and to a lesser extent in Jordan. This is if you're looking at the Middle East, the piece of the puzzle that you need to look at most clearly is what's happening in the Arab world minus Lebanon and Syria.
Well, Saudi Arabia warned of dangerous consequences from Israel's ongoing military escalation in Lebanon and called for an immediate ceasefire. Addressing the 79th session of the UN General Assembly in New York, Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan called for preserving Lebanon's stability and sovereignty per international law and UN Security Council resolutions, and went on to say the absence of accountability and punishment despite Israel's ongoing violations of international law and humanitarian law encourages further escalation. I wouldn't think that was great support, but it might be, Jack, the Saudis making the noises they're supposed to make.
Yeah, look at what people do, not what they say. When Israel wanted to take action against the Houthis, the rest of the Arab world were quite happy to assist and to allow Israeli jets to fly over Saudi territory.
And of course, the Saudis, who are a Sunni state, have no truck with Iran, who are a Shiite state, and Hezbollah and those kinds of creations from the Iranians would similarly fall into that category that wouldn't be supported by the Saudis.
Yeah. The interesting thing that's come out of the last couple of weeks is that when Iran felt the need to respond to Israel, they really outed themselves as the power behind Hamas and Hezbollah. And the Houthis. There is no kind of doubt about it.
I think that was already understood. What struck me, Jack, is that Iran were left looking almost incapable of responding militarily. Yes. Besides firing off, quite a lot of rockets. We won't just say it was a handful. It wasn't, but some of those came from Iran. Some of them came from southern Lebanon. But they are not just outgunned, but they are also apparently, reading as much as I could on Iran over the last week or so, there is a great fear amongst the political class that that their members, the politicians and other significant figures have been basically infiltrated and have become Israeli agents.
It's a very dangerous place to be because you don't know who to trust.
Yes, that's where they are at the moment. Meanwhile, Jack, this did catch my eye, and this is an Israeli businessman close to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There's Roni Mizrahi. He said, what we see in Lebanon today will happen in Jordan next. Now, he's not a politician. He doesn't have any power to make such a thing a reality, but that sort of mindset, I would say, would not be winning any fans in Israel or outside it.
Yeah, and I don't think it will happen.
One certainly hopes not, Jack. Meanwhile, over in the United States, we are looking at certainly the polling's indicating, neck and neck. And we did mention last week that the betting markets had just tilted towards Donald Trump. I think it's $1.99 to $2.01, whereas perhaps a month earlier, Kamala was in better shape. And there's a view that Kamala needs to get out and about a bit more often. Trump is everywhere, as you would expect. She did a 60 Minutes interview, I think, last night. I haven't seen the reactions to that, which would have a fairly broad ratings across the United States. Does she have to do more? She just has to keep fighting all the way to the line, doesn't she?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that it's the liberal journalists who are saying this. Andrea Mitchell, who's she's on MSNBC. I think she's 77 years old and married to Alan Greenspan. That probably doesn't need to work, but she likes it, and she's saying that she definitely needs to get out there and do more. Otherwise, she won't win.
MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell said she's got such a big problem with men, black and white men, big problem, but also the business world. They don't think she's serious. They don't think she's a heavyweight. I'm not sure how the business world would be looking at Donald Trump, but in the meantime, Jack Smith, what's his title, Jack? DOJ Senior Counsel, something like that?
No, I think that's a matter of dispute.
Special counsel, sorry.
Yeah, there was that's a matter of dispute because of the way he was appointed, but he's effectively a special counsel, yes.
Yeah, he dropped a 165-page, shall we say, amended indictment.
This is a submission in support of the amended indictment.
Right, thank you. And that the submission came in the wake of the Supreme Court determination that a president would be immune from prosecution while in the discharge of his or her own duties, if I've got that vaguely right. It was an interesting indictment. Did you read it?
The 165 pages?
I didn't get that far, but I did have a good look through it. I watched a somewhat old documentary. I mean, it's about 6 months old now, called A Storm Foretold, where it's a German documentary where a German doco maker followed Roger Stone around from about 2018 to about middle of 2021. And it was just interesting to see Stone, who was pretty much rejected by the Trump camp by January 6th. He was there, and then he watched it all on television from his hotel room because he wasn't asked to speak at the rally. And then he could see it all going pear-shaped, and he just turned around to his wife and said, "We're getting out of here." And then Stone was putting pressure on his White House contacts, possibly including Donald Trump, seeking a broad, sweeping pardon for anyone who was involved in Stop the Steal, and that wasn't offered. So he entered stage right, left stage right, departed stage right, I should say, muttering very dark things about Donald Trump, Jack.
Yeah.
He felt betrayed by Donald Trump because Trump didn't issue a sweeping pardon for people who just messed up in the Congress, invaded the Congress, and so it was an interesting doco. It sort of puts things in a little bit of perspective, and I think it's on Stan if anyone is interested. It's called A Storm Foretold. Interesting enough. Meanwhile, Jack, we'll keep going with the politics of this. I mean, the Jack Smith indictment, none of that will be dealt with. It may not be dealt with at all if Trump wins, but if Trump loses, it won't be dealt with until 2025. One wonders how much impact this stuff has now for American voters.
Not much, because everything about that sort of thing's already known. It's already baked in.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot that was new in it.
Yeah. I think the worry for the Democrats is that a tied vote might not be good for them. Trump outperformed the polls by about 9 points in 2016 and by about 5 or 6 points in 2020. And even if as that number's coming down, because the polling's getting better and there are fewer shy Trump voters, but I think they still exist. So a tied vote isn't good for the Democrats.
We're not really a tied vote stage. And look, the other thing to say, I mean, I gather a number of our listeners will be looking at Real Clear Polling and 538, sort of what we call the aggregators of polling. The first thing I'd say about RCP is they are, and it's, they're just the aggregators. I'm not blaming them, but there's a lot of junk polling going on in the States at the moment. Part of the problem is, I'm told, is that the Trump supporters are available to provide their opinions and views on a fairly demonstrable basis. They will speak clearly, but that same group of people are not being surveyed online, so that to the same degree. That is the issue, to get them online for polling, and polling companies often will want let's say 2,000 online participants, so they'll continue to poll, not just one-off. They'll continue to poll through a period of years, and that one's been difficult to find. So if you're looking at polling and seeing it's, let's say, Kamala's leading by about 2.5, nearly 3 points at the moment, you would have to look at the methodology of individual polls to determine which are phones and which are online and which are in person. And what Jack is referring to there is a phenomenon largely known, largely understood in face-to-face polling, where people will give answers that they think the polling company wants them to give. And that may not necessarily be full-throated support for Donald Trump. But it's the online stuff you should be a little bit sceptical of too.
Yeah. What they all try and do is weight those, all the aggregators try and do is weight those polls. So
RCP don't do it much at all. 538, they used to weight, in 2020 it was very useful, but it's less now that it's owned by ABC. Not political, but Florida is bracing for the arrival of another Category 5 hurricane, Jack. Can I just remind you, there's a Caribbean mnemonic on hurricanes. June too soon, July stand by, August come they must, September remember, October all over. Now, Hurricane Milton is coming. It's a Category 5 hurricane coming just 10 days after Hurricane Helene, which is the deadliest mainland storm since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. At least 225 people dead and hundreds more are missing in the wake of Hurricane Helene, and Milton is coming, and it looks really bad. I just wanted to read the opinion of he's the Fox News meteorologist, and this is how he described Hurricane Milton. This is nothing short of astronomical. I am at a loss for words to meteorologically describe to you the storm's small eye and intensity. 897 millibars of pressure. I'm not sure what that means or in terms of hurricanes, but sustained winds of 180 miles per hour and 290 kilometres, with gusts beyond 200 miles per hour, which takes you well into the 300 kilometre per hour wind speed, and that's just going to smash any house, really, that sort of wind. And,
yes, I heard from a friend who lives in Tampa, former Chicago
Tampa was one of us affected.
Yeah, it's right in the middle of the target at the moment. They've got the car packed and they've got a hotel booked, I think, in Georgia. They're moving out.
Well, one thing FEMA is saying, that's the federal body tasked with providing aid in the event of natural disasters. They're saying that they're very pleased with the levels of evacuation that people have left. So the other issue, well, there's a number of issues that caught my eye. FEMA, as I said, is the body, the federal agency tasked with providing aid. It has a policy that explicitly excludes the homeless, Jack, from direct assistance. And that, combined with some of DeSantis's laws basically banning homelessness, which is kind of really dumb really dumb thing, means that homeless people in Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, etc., will not receive any support. Just extraordinary stuff. And then we've got this big issue, which is, I was talking to a friend of mine who just returned from the States, lives in London, and he was saying the big issue is that a lot of the houses that have been destroyed, even in places like Western North Carolina, destroyed by flooding, they have now become uninsurable. So it's become almost unlivable. This is from an agency called CTV News, Jack. Those recovering from the storm may be surprised to learn flood damage is a completely separate thing. Insurance professionals and experts have long warned that home insurance typically does not cover flood damage to the home, even as they espouse that flooding can happen anywhere that rains. That's because flooding isn't just seawater seeping onto the land, it's also water from banks as well as mud flow and torrential rains. So you can insure against a hurricane, but if you're flooded, no pay. And in any event, most private insurance companies don't carry flood insurance, leaving it all to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, as the primary provider for that coverage for residential homes. And we're just talking about people being absolutely devastated who have just lost it all, and they will not be insured, and they will rely on FEMA handouts just to get by.
The same thing applies in Australia. A lot of flood insurance excludes certain events. And I know in the United States...
It's been going on for 50 years. This is not a new thing, but we are certainly getting serious weather issues. 2 Category 5 hurricanes in October. Gee whiz. I'll say it's unheard of, certainly since satellite technology in the 1970s began to monitor hurricanes across the world.
I had a friend who's got his parents were living on one of the barrier islands on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and their house was damaged last week. And like everybody else there, you can't get hurricane insurance.
All right, just very briefly, wrapping up our US coverage, 2 American scientists, Gary Ruvkin and Victor Ambros, have won the 2024 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of microRNA. You're keeping in touch? You're keeping up with me, Jack? MicroRNA and its role in gene regulation. Well done, those 2 men. We're not entirely sure what they do, but it apparently is very, very important. But we mention this because we are getting to those days when the big prizes are coming out. So the science, literature and economics prizes will be presented to the laureates in a ceremony on December 10. That's all happens at, December 10 is the anniversary of Alfred Nobel's death, and there will be a banquet at Stockholm. At separate festivities, attend the winner of the Peace Prize in Oslo on the same day. So it's very much a Scandinavian thing. Who's your tip for the Peace Prize, Jack? Bono, again?
I believe UNRWA got a nomination.
Who did?
UNRWA, United Nations Refugees and Works Association.
Okay. Well, I don't want to be too cynical about it. We'll see how that all goes.
How could you be too cynical about the Nobel Peace Prize?
For me, they lost me when Henry Kissinger won a Peace Prize, Jack. It hasn't gone all that well. But there we go. We might run through a very brief list of those nominated next week, or what the bookies think, because I guarantee you Bono will be there somewhere or other, but about 500 to 1. Meanwhile, in the UK, Jack, well, they're going through the voluntary assisted dying legislation now, based on the Prime Minister, who made a promise to Esther Ranson before the election that we would provide time for a debate and a vote on assisted dying. So that is all happening now. What's your view on voluntary assisted dying, Jack? I'll give you mine in a minute.
It troubles me, I've got to say, and it's widespread. I think it's by next year it will be in every state and territory in Australia, I think, won't it?
Pretty much, yeah. It's all been done. These things, I think, certainly in the Victoria and New South Wales examples, it was put to conscience votes, so it wasn't party line voting.
I think the ACT will be the last one to introduce it next year. Yeah, it's always troubled me. I mean, practically speaking, in a lot of situations, doctors have made the choice to provide a lot of palliative care and to up the morphine and let things take care of themselves. But and I've never been troubled by that at all. But the idea of booking in for a death troubles me.
What I think it does is bureaucratise death, and that is why it troubles me. People can make their own decisions and should be allowed to make them. And if the trouble is with the law as it stands, Jack, without the voluntary assisted dying schemes, if you involve a third party, a loved one, a spouse, a sibling, those people can be charged after the person basically passes away. But the way in which legislators have responded to this is, well, I know the Victorian one, I know the New South Wales one fairly well. You need to have the sign off on by two independent doctors not known to the patient. You need to have all these sort of bureaucratic boxes ticked, and that's what kind of bothers me about it. All right,
it's clumsy. It would be my assessment.
Yeah, I think it's. Yeah, I mean, there are always going to be some very awful cases where life is extended, where life should not be extended, and or it may not be the wish of that person, that patient, to have his life extended. And I think there are always going to be issues around that, and there probably needs a legislative response. But yeah, when you end up with something like, tick 25 boxes and get it all countersigned by a lawyer or a police officer and things like that, I just find it a little bit much. Anyway, very briefly, Jack, because we are running out of time, the Starmer government, there's something that came across my desk. He has no principal private secretary. Now, for listeners, that is a member of the bureaucracy who comes along and joins him as his principal private secretary. He still, 3 months in, doesn't have it.
I think he has as of this week.
This week, right. So he's been in power now for 3 months, and really, that's one of the first things you tick off. It just seems to me, and I know they're copping a bit of a battering from the media, but it just seems to me that they're not ready.
If listeners are wondering just exactly what the job of the principal private secretary is, and if you remember Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister,
yes.
It's Bernard.
Yes, that's right.
That was Bernard's job. Look, it still looks a bit of a shambles. They're having public airing of internal office battles.
Yes.
And of course, the English media is very vigorous. They'll happily report this because it's drawing eyeballs. But it does look a bit of a shambles, doesn't it?
It's almost like, Jack, they're not ready. I mean, we had an election date that was known or knowable from 2 years out, and they're not ready.
And if you look at it, they call them the Labor big beasts in the UK. But Alistair Campbell, Harriet Harman, John McTiernan, they're all coming out and saying the same thing, more or less, is that it's a shambles.
Yeah, I'd say Campbell, who was the spin doctor on which the thick of it was based. I'm trying to think of the character's name. Not a very nice person. Always worth listening to, but one suspects an absolutely brutal human being at a face-to-face level. Alistair Campbell said the government must recognise that government is harder than opposition and narrate a very clear strategy. By gee, it sounds a little bit like the Labor government in Canberra, Jack.
Yeah,
but at least they enjoyed a honeymoon. This mob haven't even had a honeymoon.
No. They are just making a big mess of something. Really, they should have been looking at an easy 5 years and probably 10. And there's no guarantee it'll go beyond 5.
One of the other things that Campbell did do, Jack, during the Blair years was create a working relationship with the Red Tops, the Murdoch media, and even organisations like the Daily Telegraph, Jack, the UK Daily Telegraph, that is. And I suspect they need someone who can do that too, because they are just being picked off at the moment.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, right.
It's not going well.
Yeah, and look, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, Sue Gray, has quit.
Being pushed out, I think would be a fair assessment.
That's one of those Alistair Campbell's. We've got your resignation letter here. Can you sign it, please? And we don't care if you sign it or not, but it'd be nice if you did. But you're going. And she had a few issues around some financial matters, Jack.
Yeah, her son was a Labor candidate who got elected, and he got a lot of support from Lord Arley, who seems to sprinkle money around the Labor Party.
Yeah, all right. Now we've got a lot to cover in sport today as we move to wrap the show up. Racing and sport generally was delayed by lightning, Jack, over the weekend. Is that in Melbourne?
It was in Melbourne.
Yes, of course. With racing.
Yeah. This was Friday night at Moonee Valley, the AFLW on Saturday, and the racing on Saturday. This is a new thing. I can't remember. I've been watching sport all my life, and I'm 69. I can't remember anything being delayed for lightning until the last few years.
I played at Moore Park, so that's a fair while ago. I was playing at Moore Park, and we went off the ground by general agreement when there was this sort of green cloud hanging over Moore Park that was shooting electrical bolts onto the ground. So we took off pretty smartly. I think those things are judgment calls. We did see that with the AFL again recently. I think it was. I'm just trying to think of I think it might have been the final round of the competition, of the home and away competition, where Melbourne, I think, played Geelong and had to trudge out after a half an hour break. So they have that in the AFL. They have the rule that if it's considered dangerous, obviously people are watching weather apps and things like that. If they're considering that there is lightning strikes in the area, they will go off the ground in AFL for half an hour and they'll wait. If it remains dangerous, they can cancel the game. And we had a very strange situation of one side, Melbourne, I think, who were getting pretty soundly beaten, having to trudge out in the track for another half an hour after waiting for 40 minutes.
What would you do if it was a final at the MCG and you've got 100,000 people there, about 30,000 of whom are sitting in the open, and you take the players off and leave the spectators sitting in the open?
Well, you'd have to be stiff to be hit by lightning. I mean,
that's true.
You'd have to be pretty stiff. I have seen those stories about the blokes have been hit by lightning 5 times and so forth. It really can mess you up.
I had a look at the figures of this, and the figures I got from the United States was 2006 to 2019, so what's that, 13 years, 418 people were struck and killed by lightning in the United States. That's out of 320 million.
How many survived?
No, the 418 were killed.
Yeah, no, I understand. How many survived? There's some really interesting research on this, Jack. Some people will find once they've been hit by lightning and receive hospital treatment and survive it, some of them have sort of all of a sudden they might find that they have diminished skills in certain areas, but they will have advanced skills in others, like numeracy, for example. It's very, very strange. It seems to almost reboot the brain.
Yeah.
And it can cause, obviously, significant disability, but also you might find yourself being very, very good at calculus all of a sudden.
Mm.
Very strange indeed. Look, I'm not sure how the sports world's got to deal with it, but it's also got to be player and spectator safety. So I don't really have an issue. And, of course, the big story this week was the NRL grand final. Excellent grand final. I thought even the pre-game stuff was pretty good. I thought the AFL did a pretty good job there too in their grand final the week before. But as a game, Jack, did you watch it?
Nearly all of it. I missed the pre-game and I watched nearly all of it. Was it a try?
Yes. Oh, the Storm try.
Hmm.
No, it didn't look well. They're saying that I didn't see the angle. The angles that it showed sort of looked like he put the ball down, but they were saying that there were other angles saying that his hand was under the ball and therefore he didn't put it down.
Yeah. As it was played, I thought it was a try.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I just thought it was a great game of rugby league.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and, I am troubled by the way they adjudicate these disputed tries. I think it's almost like the onus of proof's been reversed, that, all the onus now is on the person who puts the ball down to prove or come up with evidence that they put the ball down. I think a bit of common sense could apply.
Well, the bunker has more angles than are shown to the public, and that's where they really need to fix that. Yeah, they need to fix that. Public needs to see the same things.
Yeah.
So, but look, it was a hell of a good game, and a great showcase for rugby league. But it just showed the Panthers, when it counts, are just a better side. No, they're just a better side than Melbourne.
Yeah, I thought Melbourne did really good to stay in the game as long as they did. They needed a little bit of luck and didn't get it, but that just shows how well prepared and how coached they are, because clearly Panthers were the better side.
Yeah, and 4 in a row now. They've got a way to go to beat St George, who won 11 on the trot, but 4 premierships in a row in a modern football competition is extraordinary. So well done to the Penrith Panthers, and I think also should be acknowledged that Melbourne Storm put on a really good game. They just weren't good enough when push came to shove. Meanwhile, Jack,
can I just say that from both the big grand finals, one thing that's really improved is the coaches' press conferences, coaches and players' press conferences afterwards. There is a new kind of grace about from the losers, and a nice reduction in the excessive celebration.
It used to be if you'd been beaten in a grand final, it was like you'd won the wooden spoon. Every other club that finished lower than you on the ladder had done better than you. And I think that's completely the wrong thing. I mean, we do have this celebration, NRL and AFL, do that week of celebration when the sides are preparing to do battle in their grand finals. But it used to be fairly ruthless. I mean, I would say the NRL grand final was better than the AFL grand final just because of the quality of the football.
Yes.
And obviously the AFL grand final, well, we knew the result by half time. Jack, now it's not really significant. Well, we just want to touch on the Premier League and some of the scores. Just the table after 7 games, Liverpool on top. They've won 6 and lost 1. Man City second, and Arsenal very, very closely behind them third with 5 wins and 2 draws. Tottenham 9th, Jack, and they were beaten away by Brighton 3-2 on the weekend.
Well, worse than that, they were 2-0 up at Brighton at half time.
Well, I did not know that. Yeah.
And they dropped 3 goals in 20 minutes. Mr. Postecoglou was not a happy man.
I bet. Well, that's we're getting into coach killing areas there, Jack. But Man City had launched legal action against the Football Association on the associated party transaction rules, and there's now been a finding there with both sides claiming victory. Jack, have you had a look at that at all?
No, I haven't had a look at the court case at all.
The Premier League said on Monday that City were unsuccessful in the majority of their challenge, but the City maintained, or they released a statement saying the tribunal had declared the AP2 rules unlawful and that the league had abused a dominant position under competition law. Now, this is outside of the action, if we want to call it that the Premier League is bringing against Man City for, we've discussed this, abuse of sponsors, money, those sorts of things. So it's outside of that judgment. Man City have gone at least to the courts. They've probably had a 5 bob each way sort of result, and it might have hardened a few hearts in the Football Association, Jack.
Yeah, well, the big case they're fighting is not in the courts, but it's in a private arbitration under the auspices of the Premier League. Look, this is interesting because the AFL, and indeed the NRL as well, chose not to follow the model of European football associations, but to follow the American model of the NBA, the Major League Basketball, and go down a salary cap and trade system. And the end result of that has been much, much better. If you look at the Panthers are an outlier to win 4 in a row, but it's very hard to win a lot of seasons in a row. And you look at the number of winners over a 20-year period in the AFL and the NRL, and it's excellent. It means just about every side's got a chance.
Yeah, a bit more football socialism in the AFL. And one stat, I think, is that 2 grand final sides haven't, not just the premiership winning side, but the 2 grand final sides, generally speaking, don't appear in the finals the following year over the last 10 or 15. So what we will see this year, and we'll get to, well, we may as well get onto it now, but the AFL trade and draft period is underway. It's really only for the coverage, the podcasts, the words and words written about it.
It's enormous.
It's
as big as the season.
The complexity of the rules is that's the thing that really makes me a bit awestruck, that you've got one rule that'll work one way and then it won't work the other way. So right now I can think of Carlton want a player from Port Adelaide who's an All-Australian defender, and so do Collingwood. Now, in order for that transfer to be considered by Port Adelaide, they need a high draft pick. And the Carlton and Collingwood don't have high draft picks. So they will trade away to get a pick 13, and they'll probably trade away a player to get a pick 13 to another club, and then they'll pick up that pick 10 or pick 13 or whatever it is, and then they've got some leverage. So there's all of this sort of bargain stuff going on, and it's all very, very hard to follow.
And these are tricky decisions. I'll just take you back to 2015. A young Josh Dunkley, he was Andrew Dunkley's son. You know, remember the fullback who couldn't kick over a paling fence?
Yeah.
So he's up and he's eligible for the father's son. So the Swans have a choice. They can take him or let him go somewhere else. And at the time, they thought we'd lost 3 great blokes who could really kick the ball well, and this bloke still was kicking a bit too much like his father. So they let him go. He plays for the Bulldogs in 2016 and beats the Swans in the grand final.
Brisbane Lions.
Shifts to Brisbane and beats them again this year. So
you think the Swans have got problems. Scott Camporeale, premiership player at Carlton, he's got twins, and they're both guns. So they'll be looking at all of that. Yeah, I sort of have to say I sort of come across it a bit, but I am. If anyone actually outlined the rules around the trade period and the draft period, it'd be like ticking off in the terms and conditions of Facebook. You know, it's like 4,000 pages stacked on top of each other. It seems very arcane.
Anyway, someone must be watching all this because there's a whole industry devoted to covering it in the media and social media.
Yeah. Well, there is. I mean, if you're a footballer or a football journalist, you'd think, gee, it's October, I can have a month off, but they
hit the golf course. Yeah,
so I can play a little bit of golf. Cricket, we're in a bit of a holding pattern in Australia. We've got the Pakistan side coming to Australia, ODI side coming to Australia for a 5-game series in November. Meanwhile England
they're playing
touring Pakistan.
Yeah, 40 degrees in Multan. And Pakistan were 4 for 328 at stumps on the first.
4 for 382, Jack.
382, was it?
I'll just check that because it's a fair old knock. If I know you're right, 4 for 328. I just thought, gee, that's a lot of runs to be making in a day. Shan Masood and Abdullah Shafiq both got hundreds. They put on 250. But I just looked at
it's 40 degrees.
I know, but I looked at the English bowling attack, and it clearly won't be the attack that comes to Australia. And these guys like Wokes, Atkinson and Bryden Cass, who's I think a debutant in tests this week, a former South African, are now playing for England. They didn't get a wicket. These guys really don't have – I mean, Wokes I think has got very limited experience in Pakistan. The other two, none. They're good spinners not playing. So Jack Leach is, according to the Guardian cricket writer, who's occasionally very funny, obsessing about his line and length like a pensioner going down a flight of stairs, which I thought was very funny. But yeah, that attack doesn't. If that comes to Australia, they're going to get smacked up. Their batting looks good. They haven't had a bat yet in this test. Zach Crawley, Ben Duckett opening, Ollie Pope 3. Not entirely sure about that. Joe Root at 4 doesn't want to bat at 3. Harry Brook at 5. Jamie Smith, the keeper, at 6. That looks fine to me. Then their bowling attack, well, the way it is at the moment, that's not going to succeed in Australia. They've got a few missing. Mark Wood has got a long-term injury. And the Barbasian boy, what's his name, Jack?
I can't remember. He won't play tests again, I don't think.
Yeah, he's just recovering from injury anyway.
Archer. Jofra Archer. Yeah, he's always just recovering from injury.
Yeah, he has had a bad run, but one hopes he has a decent spell without injury, and that might be the case. But he might be restricted to white ball cricket. Yeah, so the new look England attack has struggled a bit. Now, finally, Jack, racing in Singapore. They got to the end of the 10-race card, and that was it. They pulled the pin forever.
Yeah, they did. I believe Kranji's going to be turned into housing units, but
a part of it, there's a social housing element, apparently. Well, certainly because in Singapore there's a bit of a need for housing. So the land run by the Singapore Racing Association was handed back to the government. Pretty poor crowds, Jack.
Yeah, they've never really got it going. As a race course, it looks a lot like Sandown.
Right. Yeah, well, that's not a good start. And so there will be no more racing in Singapore. I looked at some news stories.
And it's gone in Macau as well.
Elizabeth II was there at one point, and 15,000 people watching the races, and now it's, in Singapore at least, left to what's called the uncles, which are sort of old blokes who sit down and have a punt.
Yeah.
Is that the way racing's going in Australia, Jack? It sounds like it might be.
No, I think racing in Australia is pretty strong.
I think they've always got problems, and they'd be fools not to believe that the sort of Peter-type issues that are raised, particularly around the Spring Carnival, Melbourne Spring Carnival and so forth, if they don't take them head on and deal with them, get their public relations right, but also change perhaps the way they administer the sport in terms of issues around equine health and safety, then they will struggle a bit. They need to. I mean, when I see people like the boss, or also the NRL boss, he knows exactly what some of the issues are, and they need to address them. They need basically to introduce issues around from foal to death ownership, so these things can be followed all the way through. They're really complex issues for racing, but yes, we're about to enter probably your favourite time of the year, Jack, and racing's favourite time of the year in Australia. That takes us out, Jack, unless you've got something weird and wonderful there.
Yeah, there's a chap, I read this little story. He's sitting on the train and a bloke comes into the carriage with him and says, there are a lot of psychopaths around here. And the bloke says, are there? He says, yeah. The bloke says, yeah, there are signs for them. And the chap goes, looks a bit troubled, goes, are there? He says, yeah, all over the place. And there followed 47 minutes of troubled silence while he just sat there and thought about this. Then the bloke gets up to go and he realised he had a bike with him. He was talking about cycle parts.
Saw a large stink on a train in the United States over a bicycle being there. It does cause a few problems. Well, thank you for that, Jack. And that takes us out for episode 90 of The Two Jacks. We'll be back next week with episode 91. We've received lots of responses from you, and we will be doing a bit of an episode devoted to listeners' letters next week. We've also got a bit of chasing up to do there too. But and so that is no better opportunity than this for me to tell you that if you want to hit me up, be on the show, ask a question, make a criticism, do whatever you like, you can hit me up on Twitter, on Jack the Insider. My DMs are always open. And then Hong Kong Jack, you can hit him up on his Substack, please, Jack.
jackhoisted.substack.com.
I should know it by now, but anyway, I don't. But that takes us out for this week, and we look forward to catching up with you next week. See you, folks. Bye.